Humble single dad fixes engine for woman in distress. 2 days later, a helicopter lands at his trailer. Before the story begins, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I love knowing how far these stories are reaching. And if you're into emotional love stories, make sure to subscribe to the channel. That way, you won't miss any of them, and you'll also help this project grow more and more. Jake Turner was crouched beside his old pickup truck, hands greasy and face weathered by the sun. The cold wind cut across the open plains of Bozeman, Montana, and the creaking of the dry trees seemed to echo his exhaustion. It was late afternoon, and the sky, tinged with a burnt orange hue, reflected off the dented trailer where he lived with his daughter. Jake's life had been simple, tough, and quiet ever since he lost his wife in an accident 4 years ago. Since then, the word luxury had vanished from his vocabulary, but the word dignity never left his heart. That's when he heard the sound of a sputtering engine. It was coming from the dirt road about 200 meters from his land. He looked over his shoulder and saw a black SUV pulled over, hood popped open. Jake wiped his hands on the stained rag tucked into his belt and walked over. A well-dressed woman with a straight posture stood looking at the engine as if she were staring at an alien machine. She wore a beige tailored coat, leather boots far, too clean for that dusty ground, and held a cell phone with no signal. "Need some help?" Jake asked, his voice deep and tired. She turned slowly. Her skin was deep brown, her eyes sharp and expressive, now carrying a mix of concern and pride. She hesitated before answering, like someone not used to relying on strangers. The car just stopped. I tried to start it again, but I think I messed something up." Jake quickly looked over the engine. There was no real damage, just a loose belt and a bit of grime in the ignition system, a simple fix, but he noticed her hands were trembling slightly. "Don't worry, I can take care of it. Just need to grab my tools." She nodded and whispered, "Thank you." She sat on the edge of the car seat, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Jake returned to the trailer, grabbed his toolbox, the same one he'd used since his 20s, and quietly got to work. As he adjusted the belt, he could feel her eyes on him. It wasn't a judging look, but it didn't reveal much either. A woman hiding a lot behind silence. "Do you live around here?" she asked, trying to break the ice. Jake wiped his sweaty forehead with his forearm and answered, "Up there, in the trailer. Just me and my daughter. It's a peaceful place. It's what we can afford." She fell silent again. The silence now felt heavier. 15 minutes later, the engine roared back to life. Jake closed the hood and gave a faint sideways smile. His first in days. "It's good to go. Just don't try climbing any mountains with it for now." Claire let out a short laugh, almost surprised she could still laugh on such a strange afternoon. She opened her purse, pulled out her wallet and offered a folded bill. Jake raised his hand, refusing it. "No, it was just a favor. Please, at least take this," she insisted. Jake shook his head. "I did it because it was the right thing to do, not for money." She looked at him, a second that lasted just a bit too long to be casual. Then she handed him a small white card with only a number embossed on it. "If you ever need help, call." Jake took the card, not quite sure why he felt a chill run down his spine. She got in the car, thanked him once more, and drove off, leaving behind a cloud of dust and unanswered questions. He stayed there a while longer, staring at the spot where the car had vanished. Then he tucked the card into the kitchen drawer, between overdue bills and Emily's school notes. Maybe he'd never use it, but life had other plans. Jake watched the SUV disappear around the dusty bend until silence once again ruled the open field. The wind kept whistling through the dry branches of the fence he'd tried fixing earlier, but now his hands didn't move. He held the small white card with just one number printed on it, turning it between his fingers like he was trying to figure out something invisible. Emily showed up at the trailer door, her cheeks red from the cold, and wearing the worn-out coat that was already too small for her. "Dad, who was that pretty lady?" she asked, with the simple honesty only a child has. Jake took a deep breath and slipped the card into his pocket. "Just someone whose car broke down," Emily smiled. "She looked like she was from a movie." He gave a half smile but didn't reply. Inside him, something had shifted. Not out of vanity or desire, but because of the way that woman so far from his world had looked into his eyes with respect. Not pity, not superiority, just humanity. That night, while Emily slept, Jake sat on the porch with a mug of now cold coffee in his hands, staring at the starry Montana sky. He tried to shake that look from his mind and failed. Tried to forget the tenderness in a simple "thank you," said with a shaky voice, and failed again. Across town, in a luxury hotel, Claire was looking at the same sky. She had already taken a shower, changed clothes, and left her phone on the dresser. But the image of that man with tired green eyes, calloused hands, and honest speech wouldn't leave her mind. She found herself speaking out loud. How can someone with so little still have so much to give? The next day, Jake got back to his routine. He dropped Emily off at school, took on 2 oil change jobs, and even helped his elderly neighbor push a truck out of the mud. By late afternoon, he was back to hammering the fence, now with holy gloves and a head full of thoughts. When he looked up, the road was empty again. No sign of the SUV, no graceful silhouette. He shook his head as if to chase off a mirage. But that night, when he opened the drawer to file away some bills, he saw the white card among the papers and hesitated. "No, that kind of woman lives on another planet," he muttered to himself, leaving the card right where it was. He had no idea that just 2 days later, the sky above his trailer wouldn't be silent anymore, and that the simple life he fought to keep standing was about to be overtaken by the deafening sound of a helicopter. Jake didn't know yet, but that small act of kindness had planted a seed, and the harvest was coming strong, bringing with it answers, twists, and a feeling he thought he'd never feel again. The next morning, the smell of black coffee blended with the low sound of the old radio in the trailer. Jake stirred eggs in the skillet absent-mindedly, eyes lost in the distance. Emily was still, yawning as she tied her worn sneakers while sitting on the wobbly kitchen chair. "Dad, that lady from the car, do you think she'll come back?" Jake kept stirring the eggs for a few more seconds before answering, eyes still on the pan. "Probably not." "Why not?" He turned off the stove, served her plate, and sat at the table. His eyes were tired, but his voice was steady. "Because people like her don't walk the same roads we do, sweetheart." Emily pouted lightly, picking up her fork. "But she was nice." "She was," he replied, glancing at the white card Claire had left, now resting on top of the fridge between faded magnets and school notes. No logo, no name. Just a number. A simple number, but one that seemed to hold an entire mystery. Jake picked up the card, turned it between his fingers. For a moment he almost slipped it into his pocket, but then he sighed and dropped it back on the fridge, like tossing away a silly idea, like someone who knows that world isn't theirs. She looked sad, Emily said thoughtfully, as she chewed slowly. Jake looked at her. "What do you mean?" "The pretty lady." She smiled, but her eyes weren't smiling. He didn't reply. He just lowered his eyes. Emily had this strange gift for seeing what grown-ups pretended not to notice. Later on, after dropping his daughter off at school, Jake went straight back home to the shed where he kept his tools. He had to finish a brake job on an old pickup truck so he could pay the overdue electric bill. But as he worked, something kept nagging at him, like an invisible itch in his thoughts. He remembered the moment Claire handed him the card. There was no arrogance in her gesture. In fact, there was hesitation, like she wasn't sure she would be welcome in that dusty, quiet world. "If you ever need help." That's what she had said. But there was something else in that look, something Jake couldn't forget. A mix of gratitude and loneliness. Later that afternoon, when he walked into the trailer to grab a glass of water, his eyes, without meaning to, turned toward the fridge. The card was still there, unmoving, like a memory that refused to be forgotten. He ran his hand over his unshaven face, thought about throwing it away, but he couldn't. He picked up the card, looked at the number again, and let out an ironic whisper. "What would I call for? She's already gone back to her world." But what Jake didn't know, and what even Claire didn't know yet, was that fate had already crossed their paths for a reason neither of them could understand at that moment. And that sometimes the paths that were never supposed to cross are exactly the ones that change everything. Outside, the wind picked up again, and in the Montana sky between heavy clouds, something was getting ready to arrive. Something that would make that little white card take flight. On Friday morning, the sky over Bozeman was clearer than usual. The dry air carried the scent of cut wood and earth. Jake was outside, finishing up the brake job on an old truck that had been sitting there for weeks. Emily was drawing in a notebook, sitting on the trailer steps, humming softly. That's when the sound cut through the sky. A deep, pulsing noise, like mechanical thunder. Jake lifted his head slowly, frowning. Emily dropped her pencil. "Dad, it's a helicopter." Jake wiped his hands on the rag in his pocket and stood up quickly. The sound grew louder. The branches of nearby trees began to shake. The ground vibrated beneath his feet. He grabbed a long screwdriver and held it tight, body tense. Helicopters didn't land out there. Ever. Emily ran to the front of the trailer, her eyes wide with excitement. The black, shiny helicopter descended onto a shallow field just a few yards from the house. The wind kicked up dust and dry leaves. Jake shielded his eyes with his hand, heart pounding. The side door opened slowly. Claire appeared, wearing a dark blue coat, elegant but simple, her hair tied back in a low bun, no makeup. Beside her stood a man in a light gray suit, sunglasses, and a formal posture. She stepped out first, and when her eyes met Jake's, something hung in the air. He didn't move, just gripped the screwdriver tighter. Claire walked toward him with steady, respectful steps. Emily turned around, startled by her father's silence. Claire stopped a few feet away. "Jake?" He didn't respond right away. He looked at her with confusion, suspicion, and something else he didn't understand. "I know this is unexpected," Claire continued, "but I couldn't stop thinking about the way you treated me, without knowing who I was, without expecting anything." Jake finally spoke, his voice low and steady. "I treated you the way anyone deserves to be treated." Claire smiled gently. "But not everyone does that." The man beside her stepped forward and extended his hand, formally. "Mr. Turner, I'm Graham, Miss Whitmore's personal assistant." Jake hesitated before shaking his hand. "Whitmore," he repeated. "Should have figured. You didn't seem like just another tourist." Claire took a deep breath. "I wasn't just passing through. I was hiding, trying to see the real world. No cameras, no last names, no masks." Jake crossed his arms. "And now? You came back to say thanks with a helicopter and a fancy suit. I don't need that." She nodded respectfully. "I know, I'm not here to pay for anything. I just needed to come back, because you reminded me there are still people who see others without labels." Jake looked at Emily, who was watching him quietly. Then he looked back at Claire. He wanted to understand why this woman stirred something in him. It wasn't her beauty, though she was beautiful. It wasn't the helicopter, it was the emptiness in her eyes. An emptiness he recognized, because he had been living with the same hollow space in his chest for years. "I don't know what you're looking for here, Claire," he said. "But I don't have much to offer," she answered calmly. "And Maybe that's why I came, because the little you have is exactly what no one else gives me." Before he could reply, Graham's phone rang. He stepped away, leaving the two of them there, face to face. The cold wind blew gently, messing up Emily's hair and lifting a bit of dust off the ground. Jake looked away and pointed toward the helicopter with his chin. "You usually use that to visit regular folks?" Claire laughed, for the first time with a bit of ease. "No. Usually it's to get away from important people." They stood in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like something was being built there, slowly. Jake took a deep breath. "Want to come in? It's a little messy, but there's hot coffee." She hesitated for a second, then nodded with a soft smile. "I'd love to." As she climbed the steps of the trailer, Emily whispered to her, "Dad," eyes shining. "Dad!" She came back. Jake just looked up at the sky, still humming with the sound of the helicopter in the background. And for the first time in a long while, he felt like maybe his story wasn't over yet. Maybe it was just beginning. Claire stepped into Jake's trailer as if she were entering a sacred space, not because of luxury, but because of authenticity. Her eyes scanned the small, modest space, the torn sofa covered with a patched quilt, the shelf with technical mechanic books and kids' drawings taped to the wall. There was life there. There was history. Jake poured 2 mugs of strong coffee. They sat across from each other at the small kitchen table, with Emily lying on the couch in the background, almost asleep. The silence was thick, but not uncomfortable. Claire wrapped her hands around the mug and breathed in the aroma before speaking. "My last name is Whitmore," she said calmly. "Claire Whitmore." Jake didn't look surprised. He just rested, his elbows on the table meeting her eyes. "I figured the suit, the helicopter, the assistant who looks like he's with the FBI didn't leave much room for doubt." Claire smiled slightly, but her eyes weren't smiling. "I'm the vice president of the Whitmore Foundation, a philanthropic organization based in New York. We fund social programs all over the country. I came to Montana personally to check out a few of them, but I wanted to see reality with my own eyes. No heads up, no entourage, no name." Jake leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "So that stop on the road," she nodded, "was real. The car actually broke down, but I was out there because I needed to get away from the bubble. I wanted to see how people treat someone who doesn't seem to have anything to offer." Jake lowered his eyes, thoughtful. Claire went on, "You were the only one who looked at me like a person, who listened to me without caring about my title, my last name, or my bank account." "I just fixed your car," he said flatly, but not coldly. "And that told me more about you than any resume ever could," she replied firmly. Jake went quiet for a moment. He felt vulnerable. This woman, with all her quiet elegance, stirred up parts of him that had been asleep for a long time, but he was a simple man used to losing, not to being chosen. Claire pulled an envelope from her bag. Inside was an invitation with the discreet logo of a luxury hotel in town. "I'd like to invite you to dinner, just the two of us. Nothing formal, no press, no speeches, just a thank you dinner." Jake raised his eyebrows, surprised. "I don't belong in places like that. I didn't either, until I got tired of pretending I did," she said with a blunt honesty that hit him hard inside. He took the envelope, looked at the name of the restaurant, but then placed it on the table. "Sorry, Claire, I don't think that's for me. All of this feels like another planet." She didn't push. She just nodded with a resigned smile. There was something melancholy in the way she did it. She stood up, adjusted her coat. "Thank you for the coffee and the honesty. I needed that more than I realized." Jake walked her to the door. Emily, half asleep, lifted her head and waved. "Bye, pretty lady." Claire smiled tenderly. "Bye, Emily." When the door closed, the trailer felt quieter than ever. Jake looked at the envelope on the table, then at the chair where Claire had been sitting. He ran his hand over the back of his neck, restless. Inside, something weighed on him. A doubt, a longing, an old fear disguised as pride. That night, he sat for hours on the porch, staring into nothing, while the invitation fluttered on the kitchen table in the breeze coming through the poorly sealed window. And deep in his chest, a discomfort was growing. He was about to turn down what might be the first step toward healing something he didn't even know still hurt. Jake was still staring at the envelope when Emily walked into the kitchen, rubbing her eyes. She saw the invitation on the table and pulled out a chair. "Are you going to the dinner, Dad?" He shook his head, trying to hide the conflict inside. "I don't know, sweetheart." Emily watched him with the quiet wisdom only a child marked by loss can have. "Maybe it'd be nice to talk to a grown-up who's not Harold's flat tire," she said with a half-smile. Jake laughed for the first time in days. That night, despite everything he'd sworn to himself, he went. He wore the least faded shirt he had, tied his shoes with mismatched laces, and walked into the hotel with cautious steps. The lobby was too big, too clean, full of people speaking softly and glancing sideways. Jake felt the weight of inequality on his shoulders, but he kept going. Claire was waiting in a private room. She wore a simple wine-colored dress, her hair down, and a subtle necklace around her neck. When she saw him, she stood up with a calm smile. "You came." Jake nodded, adjusting his collar. "Figured I should at least hear what you've got to say with a decent cup of coffee," she laughed. "Tonight it's wine, but I promise no business talk." The waiter left them alone. The food came slowly, but the silences came first. Until Claire, with a simple gesture, took off her heels and slid them under the table. "Can I be honest?" she said, her eyes glowing under the soft light. "I'm tired. Tired of looking perfect, tired of giving empty speeches to packed crowds, and more than anything, tired of being surrounded by people who see me, but don't really see me." Jake stayed quiet, then took a sip of the cheap wine that tasted expensive. "I know what that's like," he said at last. "The difference is, in my case, no one sees me, even when they try." Claire looked at him more closely. Jake took a deep breath, feeling that old lump in his throat return. "I lost my wife in a car accident. A truck ran a red light. She was going to buy a cake for Emily's birthday." Claire covered her mouth with her hand, her face filled with empathy. Jake went on, staring at the tablecloth. "After that, I lost almost everything. A big client accused me of a mechanical failure on a car I never even touched. And nobody wanted to hire a mechanic with a stained name. I found myself alone, with a little girl and bills up to my neck. I started living on the edge, but I never lied, never asked for what I couldn't pay for, and I never stopped being a dad." Silence fell over the table. Claire set down her fork, moved. "Jake, you're the exact opposite of everything I've ever known." He looked at her. "And you're the opposite of what I expected. But that doesn't mean the world outside changes." Claire lowered her eyes, fiddling with her napkin. Then she looked at him again, honestly. "Even so, you make me feel safe." The words were soft, but carried unexpected weight. She reached out and touched his arm gently. A subtle gesture, but full of something that could no longer be ignored. Jake didn't say anything, but he didn't pull away either. And that's when everything changed. They walked out together through the side door. Claire adjusted her coat while the helicopter prepared for takeoff. She stood beside him for a moment before leaving. "If one day you want to talk, just talk. I'll be there to listen." Jake nodded, unhurried. She boarded, and he stayed there, watching the blade spin, the dust rise, and Claire's graceful silhouette disappear into the sky. But the feeling that lingered was that she hadn't really left. It was like something had been left behind, inside him. 2 days after the dinner, the cold returned to the mornings in Bozeman. Jake woke up before sunrise, like always. The coffee steamed in the chipped enamel mug as he watched the low fog roll across the field in front of the trailer. He could still feel the weight of that night in his body. Not a bad weight, a good one. New, unfamiliar. The sound of a car engine approaching pulled him from his thoughts. A dark sedan stopped a few yards away. Claire stepped out with steady steps, wearing a dark grey coat and a burgundy scarf. This time, no helicopter, no heels, just her. Jake watched her walk closer. Her expression was calm, but resolute. "I hope I'm not interrupting your peace," Claire said, stopping at a respectful distance. "You already landed a helicopter here. After that, I don't think there's much left to interrupt," Jake replied with a half smile. She returned, the look with steady eyes, and held out a brown envelope. "It's a proposal from the Foundation, official." Jake didn't take the envelope. He just looked at her, cautious but not hostile. "What's it about?" Claire took a deep breath. "We want to open a community technical center in Bozeman, a place for youth from underprivileged areas to learn mechanics, auto electronics, and also get educational and emotional support." Jake remained still. She continued, "You'd be the lead mentor, not just because of what you know, but because of the life you've lived." He looked down. "I'm not a role model, Claire. I just survived. And that's more than many manage," she said gently. "You have a story that could change others." Jake crossed his arms, looking away toward the field. The wind was light, but his chest felt heavy. "I've been used before. People promised things, said they'd help. I ended up with a ruined name and a hungry daughter, so forgive me, but fancy paper doesn't impress me." Claire nodded, respecting his tone. "I understand, and I don't want you to sign anything now. Just read it, and know that this isn't charity, it's respect." Before Jake could respond, the trailer door opened. Emily stepped out with a blanket over her shoulders and messy hair. She stretched and looked at Claire with a smile. "You came back again?" "I did," Claire replied, smiling back. Jake walked over to his daughter and adjusted the blanket around her shoulders. "She wants me to work on a new project. Thinks your dad's good for more than just changing tires." Emily looked at Claire and then at her dad. Without thinking too much, she said, "Dad, maybe you fix more than engines." The sentence hung in the air, like time had paused. Claire didn't say anything, but her eyes welled up. Jake looked at his daughter. Then he looked at the envelope. He touched the paper with fingers hardened by calluses and grease. And, for a brief moment, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, hope, but he still didn't say yes. "I'll read it," Claire nodded, understanding what that answer meant. With a silent wave, she said goodbye and walked back to the car. Jake watched her leave. When he stepped inside with Emily, the envelope was still in his hands, and for the first time in a long while, he left the door slightly open. The folder with the Foundation's project was still on the table when Jake opened the door that afternoon, but instead of Claire, he found an official envelope with a court stamp. Sender's address, Mr. Thomas Halbrook, father-in-law of his late wife. Jake's stomach turned before he even opened it. Inside was a formal petition requesting custody of Emily, arguing that the granddaughter was being raised in unsanitary conditions, without proper infrastructure, without adequate resources, and under the care of an emotionally unstable man. Jake sat down slowly, the page trembling in his hands. His eyes went to the photo of his daughter pinned to the fridge with a broken magnet, a living reminder of the one thing he had, and now it was being threatened. Later, when Claire showed up unannounced, carrying a warm apple pie wrapped in a linen cloth, she found Jake sitting on the porch with his hands clasped, his gaze blank, and the paper still resting on his lap. She didn't say anything right. Away. She simply sat beside him and gently set down the dish. "Do you want to talk about it?" she asked softly. Jake took a while to answer, then let out a humorless laugh. He thinks I'm not fit to raise my own daughter, that she deserves better, a house with central heating, a school with a golf course. Claire looked at him with affection, but without pity. Do you want legal help? I've got contacts. We could... Jake raised a hand, cutting her off. No, if I accept that, people will say I only got it because of your last name. That I'm a charity case. He took a deep breath, eyes red. I need to win this on my own, Claire. For her. And for me. She nodded slowly. All right, I understand. The silence between them this time was different. There was no tension, and just respect. Claire rested her arms on the back of the chair and looked out over the open field in front of the trailer. Still want some pie? She asked, trying to lighten the moment. Jake smiled for the first time that day. If it's better than that coffee from the first night, absolutely. She got up, cut 2 slices and returned. They sat side by side, eating in silence. Emily was asleep in the bedroom, worn out after a tough day at school, already feeling the stares, the whispers, the shift in the air. The moon rose slowly, painting everything in silver. Jake told a funny story from Emily's childhood. Claire answered with one from her teenage years at a strict boarding school full of ridiculous rules. They laughed out loud, free, for the first time, truly comfortable with each other. No roles, no walls. When Claire leaned forward to set her fork down, on the dish, her hand brushed against Jake's. Both of them froze, but neither pulled away. The touch was simple, but something passed through it, like an unspoken promise, a quiet shelter between 2 tired souls. Claire broke the silence softly. You're not as alone as you think. Jake swallowed hard, still looking at the horizon. Maybe I just need to be reminded of that from time to time. She stayed a few more minutes, then stood, adjusted her scarf, and walked to the car. Before getting in, she looked at him one last time. It's going to be okay, Jake, because you fight. With your heart, he didn't reply with words, just nodded with his eyes, and stood there on the porch, watching until her car disappeared around the bend. But inside, a new battle was already forming. And this time, he wouldn't fight it alone. The Gallatin County Courthouse was packed that morning. The dark carpet, muffled footsteps, and the wood-paneled walls gave the room a solemn, almost cold feel. Jake walked in with his head held high, but his chest tight. He wore his best shirt, clean but faded, and held Emily's hand with a discreet grip, like he was holding on to his very life. Thomas Halbrook, the maternal grandfather, stood on the other side of the room in a tailored suit, surrounded by well-paid lawyers. His gaze was cold, calculated, like Jake was nothing more than a legal obstacle standing between him and his granddaughter. The judge, a gray-haired man with a stern expression, started the session right on time. For nearly an hour, Jake listened, as his past was used against him. The modest home, his unstable work history, the times he went without health insurance, all turned into arguments to paint him as a good man, but not good enough. Jake breathed deeply, trying to stay calm. Emily looked up at him now and then, her eyes filled with tears, but steady with trust. That's when the judge, adjusting his glasses, said, "There is a witness who, with prior approval, has requested to make a spontaneous statement as a citizen, Miss Claire Whitmore." Everyone in the courtroom turned at once. Claire stood calmly from the last row, wearing a simple dark dress and no makeup. Her steps were steady, but her eyes revealed the weight of the moment. She walked to the stand, placed her right hand on the Bible, and was sworn in. Then she looked at the judge and at Jake, who was watching her with quiet astonishment. "Your Honor, I'm not here as the vice president of a foundation. I'm here as someone who was deeply moved by an act of humanity. 2 weeks ago, my car broke down on a dirt road near this town. I was alone, vulnerable, and none of the nearby property owners came out to ask if I needed help. Except for one person." She paused briefly. "Jake Turner. He didn't know me. didn't know my name or where I came from. He only knew that I needed help, and he showed up with grease on his hands and honesty in his heart. The judge watched her closely. Thomas's attorneys whispered among themselves, clearly uncomfortable. Claire went on. For years, I've been surrounded by people who only saw my last name. Jake saw me as a human being. He never asked for anything, not even after he found out who I was, and that is rare. She looked over at Emily. This little girl is being raised by a father who might not have much in material things, but he has everything that matters: character, courage, love, and integrity. The judge leaned forward slightly, eyes moist. Claire finished in a soft voice. Don't take that away from her, because if you do, you'll be taking away the only solid foundation she has. Jake remained still. Claire's words hit him like waves, breaking something inside him he didn't even know was still there, the fear of never being enough. The judge called for silence. He made a few notes, took a deep breath, and said, "This court recognizes that Mr. Jake Turner provides a healthy, loving, and safe environment for his daughter. Custody remains with him. This case is closed." Emily jumped into her father's arms before he even had time to realize the battle was over. Jake held her tight, eyes shut, chest rising and falling as the weight finally lifted. Across the room, Claire simply watched. No medals, no speeches, just a look, and tears held back. When Jake stepped out with Emily in his arms, he saw Claire waiting outside. She walked over, a bit hesitant. He stopped. Emily smiled at her and, with a kiss on her father's cheek, ran off to the social worker's car. Claire and Jake stood face to face, alone. "You didn't have to do that," he said, voice thick with emotion. "But I wanted to," she answered firmly, "because you would have done the same for me." Jake hesitated for a second, then, without thinking, stepped forward. Claire welcomed him without a word, and for the first time they embraced. It wasn't a quick hug, it was a shelter, a space where two different worlds, two broken stories, met and, without knowing it, began to heal. There, in that moment, with no promises and no masks, something new began. Winter gave way to a shy spring in Bozeman. The fields, once covered in frost, now bloomed with little yellow and violet flowers. Beside Jake's old trailer, where there had once been only packed dirt and silence, now stood a light wood shed with wide windows and a hand-painted sign, Turner Whitmore Community Center. Jake only agreed to be part of the project on one condition: no changing his life with empty promises. He wanted to keep living on the same land, watching the sunset from the same porch, hearing his daughter's footsteps on the wooden floor. Claire understood, and she respected it. She adapted everything so the project would be theirs, the town's, the real people's, not some corporate display piece for social image. Months passed. The center blossomed. Young people who once felt invisible were now learning how to fix engines, build bikes, and create. The trailer was still there, its soul intact, but now surrounded by life, laughter, and purpose. That afternoon, the sky was clear, and the air smelled of kettle corn and cornbread. It was Community Fair Day, organized by the students of the center themselves. Food stalls, handmade crafts, and local music surrounded the workshop. Children ran around, families smiled. Emily, in a light blue dress and a crooked straw hat, pulled a homemade lemonade cart with a hand-painted sign, "Best in the Fair." Jake walked slowly between the booths. He wore dark jeans and a rolled-up shirt to his elbows. He carried 2 bottles of water and watched the scene with eyes that still weren't used to so much human warmth all around, but didn't want to live without it anymore. Claire appeared next to him, holding 2 small pies in paper boxes. "I traded them for an oil filter and a promise of a mechanics class," she said with a playful smile. Jake laughed. "Bozeman will never be the same after you." She looked at him softly. I didn't change anything. I just helped reveal what was already here. They walked side by side through the crowd. Occasionally, someone would greet them, others simply watched. But in that moment, Jake no longer cared what people thought. Neither did Claire. They no longer hid. Emily ran past them, cheeks red from laughing. "Dad, we're winning the coolest booth contest." "Of course you are," he shouted back proudly. "You're my daughter." Claire looked at him. "You change when you talk about her." "She's my whole world," he answered without thinking. She went quiet for a moment, then stopped and gently touched his arm. "And you changed mine." Jake looked at her. This time, he didn't look away. They stood there, surrounded by voices, music, and laughter, but the world seemed to pause around them. They didn't say anything. They just smiled at each other, like two people recognizing a place they never should have left. Claire broke the silence softly. "Have you noticed how we always end up back in the same place?" Jake gave a half smile. "Maybe it's because that place is where our hearts finally get to rest." In the background, Emily ran again, arms outstretched like she was flying, and there, between a candy stand and a makeshift wooden bench, Jake and Claire understood that love didn't arrive. Like a lightning bolt, it came like someone asking permission, and it stayed. At the end of that golden afternoon, as the fair began to come down and the sky turned copper and lilac, Jake sat on the same wooden bench where months earlier he used to drink cold coffee alone. But now, around him, there were voices, life, and Emily's laughter echoing like good music in the background. Claire stood nearby, helping one of the center's students take down the signs from the handmade jewelry booth. She wore a simple cotton dress, her hair tied in a loose braid. She was no longer the untouchable executive who stepped out of a helicopter. She was just Claire, and that was enough. Jake looked at her like someone looking at an answer. The sun lit part of her face when she turned, as if she knew he was thinking about her. He smiled, and it was in that moment, with his eyes fixed on her, that his voice came in as narration, filled with truth, memory, and peace. "I thought my life ended when I lost my wife." The image changes. Jake in silence, inside the workshop, teaching. Two boys how to take apart a carburetor with patience. Emily running through the field with a little dog they had recently adopted. But sometimes God just pulls over for a while to fix what's broken inside. Flash of an old photo of Jake and his wife in a dusty picture frame. The same photo now joined by a new one. Him, Emily, and Claire smiling together on the day of the center's official opening. It wasn't the helicopter that changed my life. It was the woman who stepped off of it and chose to stay. The narration fades. Back to the main scene, Claire sits next to him on the bench, hands him a water bottle, and gently rests her head on his shoulder. He naturally intertwines his fingers with hers. There's no ceremony, no announcement, just a quiet agreement between two hearts that no longer need to prove anything. She whispers with a soft smile, "I don't think I can live far from this sky anymore." Jake answers, his voice low and steady, like someone claiming home. "Then stay, because now it's yours too." In the background, the last rays of daylight touch their faces as the sign for the community center glows quietly. With small solar lights, a child reaches out to Jake, hands covered in grease and pride, holding their first technical training certificate. "Thank you, Mr. Turner." Jake looks at him with tearful eyes. "No, son. Thank you." The camera slowly pulls back, revealing the workshop, the trailer in the background, the community gathered around simple tables, the lights glowing in a warm amber tone. Emily runs between the tables and returns, laughing, into her father's arms. This wasn't the beginning of a happy ending. This was the beginning of something real, a love that didn't shine all at once, but that lit up and stayed. Now tell me, what did you think of this story? Leave your rating from 0 to 10 in the comments. I really want to know how much it moved you. If you liked it, give the video a thumbs up, share it with someone special, and subscribe to the channel to keep following stories like this one. And before you go, I picked another touching story that will definitely move your heart even more. You won't want to miss it.